pleasure to get to do this and to get to talk with Tejal. So I'm Angela Smith. As Catherine mentioned, I'm counsel here at Allscripts, and it is my privilege to introduce Tejal Vakharia, who is our lead speaker today. Tejal is Allscripts Senior Vice President and General Counsel, Marketing and Government Affairs. And in this role, Tejal leads Allscripts Legal and Compliance Affairs teams, as well as the Government Affairs Group, Marketing, and Privacy and Security teams. Tejal is also executive leader of the Allscripts Women's Experience. Prior to joining Allscripts, she held several compliance, business, and legal leadership positions at General Electric and Abbott Labs, and she was also an attorney at various multinational law firms. Tejal earned her law degree and her master's in public policy degrees from the University of Michigan, as well as a master's in social science and a bachelor's in philosophy from the University of Chicago. So we are delighted that Tejal can talk with us today. Tejal, would you like to provide a little bit more detail about your other roles?
Yeah, so nice meeting you all. So for a little bit of background, I have two fantastic kids and three very successful stepkids ranging in age from 11 to 29. I have an extremely strong partnership with my husband, who is also general counsel of a company, and my amazing in-laws and wonderful mom live with us. And I add those adjectives because, as you will soon see in a bunch of my stories, we don't always come across very flatteringly. But it's the difference between a lived life and an Instagram one, where a lot of times they're not very flattering, but those are the elements that we live with every day. So outside my professional life, there are two areas that are important to me that would kind of make my elevator speech about who I am. So besides my responsibilities at Allscripts, I'm also on multiple not-for-profit boards and committees, because I think a well-lived life leaves the world a better place, and each of us have to do our part towards that. And then honestly, what I spend a lot of my time with is making sure that my kids are on a path to be smart, kind, and productive members of society. And we are history and nature geeks, so we love traveling and visiting museums and national parks.
Thanks, Tejal. That's amazing to hear. Thank you. So with all of the roles Tejal fills, you can certainly see that she knows a thing or two or 100 about managing many demands, which is why she is ideal to lead our discussion today on grace and resilience. As I mentioned, I'm privileged to work with Tejal, and I've been very fortunate to work with her for several years. And by way of backdrop, I can tell you that my experience in working with her highlights a few things, brings a few things to mind. One, as you will hear today, she's an amazing coach and leader, and she's remarkably approachable and relatable. And she often relates stories that make an impression and are memorable because they are just that relatable and they're identifiable for many of us who hear from her. She leans into and owns her stories unapologetically and in a way that's empowering for others and for her team. And so that kind of encapsulates why she's so ideal to talk about this topic of grace and resilience. So with that, let's just jump right into our discussion. And Tejal, if you can set up the foundation of our chat today, what does grace mean to you, and how do you incorporate that into your professional life? Because we don't often hear grace in work life. We hear that in other contexts, but not so much in our professional worlds. So what does it mean to you, and how do you make that work?
Absolutely. So for me, what grace means is that you forgive yourself and you forgive others. So you give credit to intention, not just results. And you kind of acknowledge that we are all works in progress, and all we can do is strive to be better tomorrow. And I use the word strive very purposefully, because there will be times we're going to fail. And that has to be something that's when we need the grace, right? So it's about having that internal fortitude to be willing to fail. You forgive your mistakes, look to see if there's something different or something you would change, and then you move on. And that's really what I think grace means in a spiritual context. And I think it's really important in this context as well for exactly those reasons. when you think about like when you get grace, like I said, in a religious context, what it usually means is it's that forgiveness that comes, right? You can't erase what you did incorrectly, but it's the forgiveness that comes because there's an acknowledgement that you're going to do it differently or not going forward. And I think that's part of it. And so it's about, and the reason I think it becomes so important in the work context is without that willingness to fail and without that ability to give yourself grace, it's really hard to step outside your comfort zone. Because the only time you really need grace is when there's a chance you're going to fail. And the chances to fail really come when you're outside your comfort zone. And the corollary or the inverse of that is that if you don't give yourself that ability, you also can't grow. Because for me, growth and grace are connected to each other. To grow, you need to be outside your comfort zone. And that's when you may need grace. From a professional standpoint, it lets me take on things that I'm just not an expert in because I know what I'm good at and I know where I can and cannot add value to a subject matter, even if it's not my forte. And it lets me say yes, despite my doubts, and I have them, and I have a lot of them, but it lets me say yes. And an example probably from a personal context or professional context, I should say, would be a few years ago when I was asked to have the Chief Information Security Officer report to me. And as you've kind of already pointed out, I'm a philosophy major, right? So the last time I programmed something was in high school in Pascal. So this is not a natural piece for me to necessarily take over, but I'm good at building teams and I'm good at translating technical requirements into business practicalities. A lot of times because I'm not afraid to ask the questions and just admit that I don't understand. And I just keep asking questions until I do understand. And so because of that, and the privacy function already reported to me, and privacy and security go together, there were a lot of reasons why it was the right thing for the company to do, but it did involve me stepping out of my comfort zone. And I could say yes. And to this day, and I mean literally even today, I give myself grace for all the technical aspects that I failed to understand. And Catherine and I were on a call earlier today where there were a lot of questions of the technical people where I'm going, explain to me how this works, or tell me how that part works. And each of those are examples of grace, right? Because I don't have to know everything. First of all, I can't. But besides that, I'm willing to take on those pieces because of the fact that I'm willing to give myself grace and willing to rely on others to make me look good and help me through the pieces that I'm not as good at. I actually think it's one of the reasons why I love building teams, because it's great to put together something where you have all of these people of diverse talents and you bring it together and you build something that's stronger than any individual part. And I think it's especially applicable to women, because I've heard that men will look at a job description and apply for a job if they meet 50% of the criteria, and women need to meet between 80 to 100% of the criteria before they're applying. And that's, again, an example of where when we're not willing to give ourselves grace, it hurts us.
That's really, really important to hear. And I took several important takeaways from that. So I think if we just pause before we get to the takeaways, can we all just acknowledge how relatable your examples are? I know that I personally am reluctant to say yes unless I'm very, very certain that I meet most of the criteria or the role requirements. And it's important to be willing to fail. So I think a memorable phrase that I heard and will keep in mind is that growth and grace go together. I think that's fantastic. So if I can follow up on that, then how do you extend grace to yourself?
Yeah, that's hard. Don't get me wrong, right? Every day it's something you have to keep working on. It's not easy, especially for people who tend to be very driven and very much self-critical. And so I can give you a list of things I don't do well, right? So it's hard to then step outside yourself and really do that. But you have to. And part of it is because it's really the only way you can balance everything that we have to balance in today's modern world. And so let me give you a personal example. So a few months ago, I forgot to feed my kids. My younger ones, I think I mentioned, are 11 and 14. And I was on a call that was supposed to end at 6. And my husband and I were supposed to then run an errand that we had to do together. And my call went till 7. And the whole time he was asking me, how soon am I going to be done? And so as soon as I was off, we left and we returned around 8. And I walk into the house and I see that there's dishes in the sink and a yogurt cup that was sitting there that was not there when I left. And I turned to my husband and I asked if he had fed the kids, and he goes, no. And he had assumed that I had taken care of it because I normally do. And I assumed that because he knew that I wasn't free and he was free at 6, that he would have taken care of it. And so grace really comes in at this point in time to forgive myself, because I know mistakes are going to happen. And grace comes in actually in another really important way. When I looked back at that moment the next day and I thought about what I would change about my life going forward because of it, the answer was nothing. And that's an important part of grace as well. And the reason it's so important is, as long as the consequences are manageable, it's okay to build in the possibility of occasional failure into the system. My kids did not starve to death, right? There was no bad consequences. They actually showed some resilience themselves by figuring out that, yes, there is food in the refrigerator, and they just have to open it to get to it. And so, again, you have to also balance that, not just because every time that there's a failure that there needs to be a correction. Sometimes that's just part of how the system works. And so I think that really is, oops, that was my phone falling. I think that's one of the critical ways in which I do, it's not easy to, but I do try to give myself grace every day. And sometimes, like I said, it's retrospective, right? So when you're thinking about something that happened afterwards and you really have that moment to really think about, okay, what would I change? What would I not change? And it's putting it in that context that I think really helps me give myself grace.
Oh, that's really good. It's really, really good. Thanks for sharing that, because again, I think so many of us can identify, and it's important because we do identify. It's important to share those kinds of stories, because I think that transparency normalizes challenges, right? It becomes normal for us to sometimes have a failure, and once we see those failures as just part of the process, then we can move on and focus on solutions. And it's empowering to hear that. So with that, then how did you develop your resilience muscle? Do you think it's something that's just innate, an innate characteristic or trait, or is it something that you have really actively honed as a skill?
So it may be innate for some people, but it's definitely not for me. For me, it involves a lot of acknowledging and managing my fear of failure, my insecurities, and my feeling of imposter syndrome. And it probably also, just from a personality standpoint, involves me overcoming some of my introversion, because I'm actually an introvert. And right now, if you could feel my hands, they're frozen because I hate speaking in public, right? And so talk about stepping outside your comfort zone. It's something I've learned to do rather than want to do. And even this now, having done it so many times, it's still something I have to mentally prepare myself for rather than ever become fully comfortable with it. But it's another example of where, well, where it really is something where it always is, it's a set of skills you teach yourself when you want to step out of that comfort zone, right? The most comfortable thing for me to say would have been when Catherine asked, was to say, no, I'm good, thanks, right? But it is constantly something that I keep having to acknowledge. And there are times where I fail to step outside my comfort zone. And then when I reflect on that, I think about why, and I think about, again, is there something I would change about what I said or did? And just constantly keep going through it. And maybe for me, it comes from being a daughter of immigrants, or a minority and a woman, or an introvert or a geek, but I never really feel like I fit in. And so I've developed kind of a series of coping mechanisms. And so I'd say first, I'm pretty good about making sure I kind of know myself. So I know what are my strengths and I know what are my weaknesses. And I have to keep reminding myself that that is true for everybody. None of us actually live Instagram perfect lives, ever, right? And I think in some ways, and they've seen this somewhat, right? That they've seen that if people spend too much time on Facebook looking at other people's lives, they actually get depressed. That you would think it'd be a way to connect, but it actually results in sadness. And but that's because we inherently assume that the good things we see that people post are not curated. that they're not Instagram ready, right? Where they're meant to just show you the best. And that's just not how most of our lived lives are. And I think a great example of that for me was, I remember seeing a picture my sister-in-law posted of this fantastic vacation of her kids smiling and my brother smiling and her smiling, and they looked great, right? And I remember me saying, "Oh, that was a really great picture." And she goes, "Yeah, it was the one moment they weren't fighting." Right? And I think that right there kind of encapsulates it. If you only saw that vacation picture of theirs, you would think that everything is Instagram perfect in her life, right? And I think that's part of the problem, is that in today's world, what we present to each other, even like when you read my bio, right? You see the Instagram perfect version of me. And what I'm hoping some of these stories do is really help people realize that there's no one's life that looks that perfect. Definitely not mine. And it doesn't mean that, and just because your life doesn't look as perfect doesn't mean we're failing at it. It just means that you're living it. But to really develop some of that. So for me, knowing that piece is really part of the coping mechanism, right? Is really knowing myself, knowing my strengths. The other thing I would say is, I've learned over time, and it actually came about from one of the first like kind of formal mentors I had. And she had me do a 360. And I get my 360 back. And I do what I think a lot of people do, which is I went through the whole thing and I marked up all of the things that I was bad at. And I put together a plan as to how I was going to do each one of those things better and really work on them. And I go to meet with her and she's like, "Okay, what have you come up with?" And I tell her my plan. And she goes, "That's totally wrong." And I look at her and she goes, "Look, your value to yourself and your company is to maximize that which you do well. And while there may be some emotional need to focus on all the things you do poorly and try to do them better, that's not where your value comes from." So really, when you think about it, she said, break up everything you have that you do into 3 buckets. Things you do well, and that is where 80% of your energy should be spent. Then there comes the stuff you don't do well, right? And she's like, and that breaks up into 2 parts itself, right? The things you do well that matter, and the things you don't do well that don't matter. She's like, you need to figure out which those are. If it's something that's fundamental and it matters because it's actually going to impede your progress and what you want to get to, you spend time on fixing that one. But the stuff that fits into that last bucket where it doesn't matter, you just leave it alone. And it was one of the best pieces of advice I've ever gotten, because it really helped me stop focusing on all my flaws and really focus on what is it I do well. And then honestly, when I'm building teams or working with others, finding people who are really good at the parts that I just don't do well. So one of the things I will say is I'm not a very organized person. It's not how my mind works. My mind, I think in circles. I can't file anything. And I'm not kidding, because in my mind, anything I read has at least 6 or 7 different places it could get filed, because I see 6 or 7 different connections between it. Now, from a problem solving standpoint, that works fantastically, right? Because I see all kinds of connections constantly that help me solve problems. But from an organization standpoint, it's awful, because I have no idea how to file it or where I'm going to find it again, even if I did file it. So again, I've learned over time that you really need to know yourself and then really lean into your strengths. And then from some very practical standpoint, kind of again, talking about like why I'm willing to come out and just do today's presentation, even though that's outside my comfort zone. So one, I've learned to sublimate my immediate desires to my longer term goals. And so while right now my fight or flight reaction is definitely geared towards flight, and my hands are cold and my body has sucked all its heat to its core so I can run away, I know that initial desire I have needs to be sublimated to the greater good, which is helping others. And so some of it is suppression of those initial desires and fears. Next, I imitate what I want to be, right? So I look and see what other people are doing that I admire or doing well. And I try to say, okay, how do I imitate it? How do I build that aspect into my life? And that's another aspect by which I help manage some of that feeling of grace, right? because I pick out the role model. I talk to myself a lot, by the way, and tell myself, okay, well, if I want to do this, and it's really kind of thinking through that piece to kind of then also tap down expectations of myself, right? Because I'm not going to do it perfectly the first time. I may not even do it well, and I may ultimately decide that even if there's something I really want to do, that it just doesn't fit on my dance card, right? But I try to think about what are those role models that I want to be and figure out the ones that I want to imitate. The other way I think is I consider the alternatives. And what I mean by that is the first time I presented to a large audience, it was an absolute disaster. And I mean a complete disaster. There was a snowstorm and the person who was supposed to present couldn't. And so they asked me to present 2 different talks on compliance within 4 hours. So I had 4 hours to prep and go and present. And I get in front of the audience and I'm stumbling and I'm fumbling and I'm reading from my notes and I'm coming across as totally incompetent. And then now we have a break before my second presentation. And I have some time to reflect. And my choices are to have my second hour go as badly as my first, or to just tamp down my anxieties, stop reading from my notes, and turn it into a conversation, which I'm just much better at than a lecture. And it went from probably a 1, which is how I would grade it, to a 6. Not great, but much, much better. And that's kind of what I mean by really having that reflection of, okay, what are the alternatives? And if I, depending on which alternative I go to, does it let me help get me to the goal that I really want? Another technique I have is I have backup plans, right? So one of the ways I tamp down my anxieties is I have a plan, and usually a backup plan, and then often a backup plan to my backup plan. So that way I know that if I'm going to get stuck, I have another way out. And that helps me handle some of the anxieties that come from some of it. And then last but not least, I would say I spend a lot of time being grateful. And I know that sounds crazy, but I think that's one of the reasons I can give myself grace. Because I spend a lot of times feeling that either but for the grace of God or because of the grace of God, I have what I have. And it would be a waste to not maximize it. And so in that, I'm also able to, in the gratefulness, I'm able to extend myself grace for the mistakes that I am making. So I know that's a long explanation for what you're looking for.
No, this is fantastic. So I have several juicy nuggets that I heard in developing our resilience muscles. So if I can recall, what you said is first we have to start with knowing ourselves and focusing on our strengths, remaining focused on our goals, right? Those are all very introspective, self-reflective type activities. But then there's some coping mechanisms that you've developed and that you've honed over time. And some of those include starting with identifying what or who you want to be and working toward that, imitating that. Another you mentioned is consider the alternative, right? You know, what's the next best option? What's the alternative to what's in front of you? Having backup plans and then backup plans to the backup plans. And then lastly, but probably I think more powerful than several of the others is gratitude, because gratitude gives us a sense of perspective and it just helps us realign our priorities, right? So lots of great nuggets there, and I'm pretty sure that I speak not just for myself but others that are listening, that what we hear is this ability to give ourselves grace is the foundation of resilience, right? The more grace we give ourselves, the easier it gets for us to bounce back from setbacks and get to solutions and move forward, because it's all just part of the journey. So thank you for sharing those. So now I'm going to pivot a little bit to a little more practicality of what I've heard you refer to as work-life flow. What does that mean to you, and how do you make it work?
So I've mentioned a little bit about my personal life. And so what I would say is it means I focus on the substance and not the form. I gave up a long time ago having a fixed time when I work and a fixed time when I don't. And I kind of move between work and home almost constantly. And sometimes if one is physical and the other one's mental, I may be doing both at the same time. And so I've taken dozens of calls from parking lots and hallways while my kids are in activities, right? They don't need me mentally present, and I don't need to be physically somewhere to be able to do my job well. And so, and one of the things I value the most about my job is that ability to be able to flow from work to home. It's why a job that would offer me more money but less flexibility would not work for me or my family. So some of it is also really just thinking about, where do you want, what is it you want, and what is it you need as a whole from your family, for your family as well. The other thing I would say is, it was something, again, that I had read in an article a long time ago that talked about a two matrix system, right? And it said you put a matrix together, and one has important and unimportant, like as one axis, right? And it has urgent and not urgent as the other one. And obviously, we all do the important and urgent stuff first, right? That there's no question. But the problem becomes trying to prioritize between the urgent but unimportant and the important but not urgent, right? That's really where the balance really comes in. And so it's constantly thinking of ways to make sure that we find a way to prioritize in the important but not urgent, even when the urgent but not important is easy to do first, right? So, you know, there's a sale on for shoes at Nordstrom's, and I'm going to go buy it now. I mean, urgent, probably not as important. I'm going to take time to plan out the next vacation we're going to take. Probably not urgent, right? I can do it today or tomorrow or the day after. But if I keep pushing it day after day, it stops, the importance piece of it doesn't come in. And I would say that also comes up just with a lot of professional things as well, right? Professional development. There's no day you have to sit down and actually network or get a new skill. But if you don't do it periodically and every so often, a lot of time passes that you end up spending on less important things just because they were less urgent. And for anyone who hasn't seen it, or anyone who, like me, is somewhat of a procrastinator, there's actually a great TED Talk on procrastination. It's about the mind of a procrastinator that is just hilariously funny for anyone who hasn't seen it. It's absolutely worth seeing. But it is one, and one of the things it ends up talking about is, how does a procrastinator handle, exactly, to some extent, this question, right? How do you make things that are important but not urgent enough that you do them? And some of it is just simply as putting techniques on where you actually put them on your calendar, or you do other things like that force them to be urgent. So that way you actually spend the time on it. And I've heard some people block time on their calendar once a month to be able to do some of these things. But whatever technique works for you, I would say one of the critical things is really balancing between the important and the urgent. The other piece I would say is that in terms of the flow, right? So when I'm balancing that, I know that there are certain things that are urgent for work, and there are certain things that are urgent for home, and there are certain things that are important for work, and there are certain things that are important for home. And so what the flow really lets me do is prioritize each of those as I need to on any given moment in time. And I don't kind of have those fixed structures of saying, well, I work from this hour to this hour. And there are times where I do have that, right? There are times where it is well, during this time, I need to be at my kid's school for this thing every week or whatever it happens to be. So if that is the case, then that becomes important. And then you take the time to do it, even if it is in the middle of the day. And then you just find other times that you can instead flow back towards the work stuff and get it done. So and the nice thing is, over time, kind of like the muscles and stuff we've talked about, as you start doing that and you start building that in with just how your family and friends and kids think about it, they don't actually, because one of the big questions is, well, then do they feel neglected when you're doing this? And I would say no, they start understanding. And I'll give you a quick story, which is, there was one that we were in the middle of an event. I was working all hours of the day, and finally it's resolved the issue, but it had been over a week of just working almost every night, every morning kind of thing. And I was starting, and it was it was the weekend now, the resolution was in hand, and I start hearing mommy, 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 mommy. And I turned to my son, who was probably about 8 years old at the time. And I go, mommy's offline. And he goes, okay. And he walks away, right? And then a little while later, I go and I find him and I help take care of what he needs to. And a few months later, I was doing something and I'm like, and I turn to him and I go, I just can't do this right now. And he goes, oh, are you offline? Right. So it's interesting, right? Because they start picking up on that as well. And I'm like, yeah, I'm offline, but I'll be back online in about 15 minutes. He's like, okay. Right. I mean, so they start adjusting as well. And it's great because then it becomes a family unit and a family problem, right? Rather than just my problem.
Wow, that's amazing. So lots of highlights there. These are great strategies for managing overwhelm. And it sounds as if it all comes back to the previous discussion we just had about being self-reflective, right? Taking the time to reflect on whether we're making decisions out of habit or practice, or as you've said, form over substance. And once we evaluate, is this urgent? Is it important? Is it now? Is it not important? And am I making a decision that is the right decision for me at this time? It sounds as if it can be very freeing. I also imagine that this approach to managing work and life as kind of a fluid analysis has been helpful with managing some of the net effects of pandemic, right? Because some of us are struggling with this notion that we just cannot turn work off. But your approach is different. Your approach is there are times where family priorities or other obligations that don't require me to physically be present at work, they adjust. And there are times when you're offline. And just kind of flowing back and forth between those two realms sounds like it can be quite freeing.
It really is. It really is because some of it is because otherwise, if you don't do that, the corollary, right? So this goes back to, well, what's the other alternative? The other alternative is to feel guilty that I'm not doing enough at work and I'm not doing enough at home, right? Because someone else has a better alternative, but that's what I found as the alternative. I don't like that alternative. So if that's my alternative, then this seems to be the better way of managing it.
Got it. That makes an awful lot of sense. So you've talked about the quadrant approach, and we've touched on that a couple of times now. How it helps to isolate and identify, and then manage priorities. Um, do you have other examples on how taking that quadrant approach has helped with your work-life flow?
Yeah, absolutely. So the way I see things is I see things as all of us have a limited amount of time, money, skill, and interest. And we have to decide of those, of the capital we have in each of those, where are we going to spend it? And so, and so and it's a balance between those. And that's how I decide kind of how my work and life flow is figuring out where I'm going to spend each one of those things. Where am I going to spend my time? Where am I going to spend my money? Where are places where I can spend money instead of time so I can free up more time for other things? Where are things that I don't have the skills or I have the skills such that spending my time makes more sense than spending my money? And then honestly, things that I have interest in, right? So things that I want to do, even though it may be easier and cheaper for me to hire someone else to do it, but I have an interest in doing it. So I want to do it myself. And so I would say those are the four things that I'm constantly thinking about how I want to balance out, because those are all limited resources for all of us, right? Time, money, skill, and interest. And so another example, and this is kind of a personal one, there was one Saturday morning, and my husband hates when I tell the story, I should say. So I was rattling off to him a list of all the things I had failed to get done the week before, right? Because I'm extremely self-critical, right? And this is why I have to keep extending myself grace. So I was running through in my head and then out loud to my husband the list of all the things that I wanted to get done that I didn't get done. And my husband helped by adding to the list. And adding other things that he thought I should have gotten done that I hadn't. And believe it or not, that is an act of love. And as I said before, this is why I started out by saying I have an extremely strong partnership with my husband, because we actually are very open and honest with each other. And so, but what came out of it was a very frank discussion between us, is that we kind of had to hire a husband and a wife, right? That between our jobs, our lives, there were things that normally kind of like a traditional husband would take care of in the house that he was never going to have time to get to. And there were things that you would just assume the wife would have traditionally taken care of that I was never going to be able to get to. And so we did. We hired 2 people who took care of those things for us. And it was an example where we had more money than we had time. And the value it brought to our lives by not having to worry about those things was immense, right? So all of the honey-do lists that I would normally have put together for, him to take care of, there's someone else. There's a handyman that we now just have come in. I text him when the list gets long enough. I text him the list and say, here it is. He comes, he takes care of all of it, right? So that's a great example. Another one, I know, Angela, you and I have talked about this, was my son, my youngest son, is an extrovert, and I mean a complete and absolute extrovert. He loves talking. He processes and learns through sharing with others. And he is surrounded in a house of introverts, of people who would much rather, and we spend our day already on the phone and talking with people, we would much rather just be by ourselves by the time the evening comes along. And sometimes well before it, because he's done at school at 3 o'clock, right? So talking about the pandemic. So at 3 o'clock, he's done and ready to talk. And I still have many, many meetings that are still going to happen. And so our solution was, we hired someone to talk to my son. And I know that sounds crazy, but it was actually someone who had run a camp with him over the summer, and they had gotten along great. And it was a virtual camp. And so for 2 hours every day, they put together their own activity list and they do it together. And they both have a fantastic time doing it. And what I would say is, one of the critical things about that is also realizing I don't have to be the one that fulfills all of the needs of my family. And that outsourcing itself is not a failure. And I would actually argue that I've outsourced all kinds of things, including when the kids were younger, loving them to their grandparents, right? Because they just did it better than I did. And the only thing I wasn't willing to outsource was teaching my kids values, because then they would learn someone else's values instead of mine. So that was the one thing that I've always kind of held on to, right? But besides that, there's very little I'm not willing to outsource if outsourcing makes sense when I'm trying to balance time, money, skill, and interest.
That is fabulous. Fabulous. And you're leaning into those stories and being willing to be transparent about them, as we've talked about before, made such a difference, because I also have that really extroverted child who's, I think, the same age as yours, and never even crossed my mind that he would so appreciate having someone else to talk all of his science interests with, and they could build things virtually, and it's been amazing. So never would have crossed my mind to be that creative. But the net effect is that being resilient and recognizing that we each have to give ourselves grace promotes creativity, and it gets us to solving problems. And if that means delegating or outsourcing, great, but it starts with acknowledging that we cannot do everything, and that's okay. And it allows us to move forward. So
I'm going to interject for a minute, if you don't mind.
Absolutely.
I'm sorry, because I love the back and forth here. I just want to make sure, because we only have a couple minutes left, that if people have questions, they're able to ask them. You're welcome to ask them in the chat room or raise your hand. I know somebody did make a comment in the chat room that I thought Tejal and Angela, you might want to speak to, which is the importance of extending grace to others, as well as yourself, and what that looks like, professionally, personally, either.
Yeah, so I will address that. And I'll start with a story for that as well. So I remember when my older one was just born, and and my husband was going to bathe him, and he must just have been maybe a week or so old, right? We had just brought him home, and generally I had been the one bathing him, and we're, like I said, so now my husband's going to bathe him, and I start giving my husband all kinds of instructions as to how to bathe him. Now, as I pointed out, I have 3 older stepkids, so this wasn't my husband's first time with a child, even though it was mine. So he turns to me and let's just say is not appreciative of the fact that I am giving him instructions as to how to bathe the kid. And he turns to me and he says something really wise, which is, he's like, if you want me to do it, and if the purpose is for me to bond with him, you kind of have to let me do it. And I think the reason that was so important, and he was right? And I did. Then I left it and I walked away. And he bathed him probably differently than I did, and that's okay, right? And so when it comes to grace for others, I would say it's 2 things. One, where you do leave it up to somebody else to do something, you need to let them do it in their way. First, there's not enough time to micromanage everything that exists in the world. 2, it's actually empowering to them to be able to do it their way. And that's how you learn. 3, you may actually learn something from it, because, you know, in today's world where ideas really are the thing that drives everything, the fact you're never going to be able to think of everything, and letting someone else do it is not only empowering but important if you're actually going to get a lot of things done. And then it goes back to the other piece of giving them grace, of them doing it differently doesn't mean you did it wrong. It doesn't mean they did it wrong. It just means that you have different ways of doing it. And there's times where you just totally disagree. Like, we will walk through I remember walking through a mall with my husband and my kids wanted to do something, like some activity. And I'm like, no, I am not paying, $20 for you guys to bounce on a trampoline in the middle of a mall when we have a trampoline at home, right? And my husband turns to them and says, that's okay. Next time when we're here alone, we'll do it, right? And it's a great example of, but that's exactly how it should work, right? And instead of being offended by that, I'm like, perfect. That's absolutely perfect. If I'm not there and you have the fortitude to bring them independently, I'm not going to micromanage how you interact with them. That is your choice. You have $20, you're allowed to spend it any way you want, right? And so some of it is, it's giving yourself grace in realizing that just because someone else does it differently than you doesn't mean you did it wrong or they did it wrong. It is giving them grace and the ability to do it their way, because you can learn a lot from it. And then it's also giving grace of when someone else messes up. I think that's also where you end up giving grace, right? Where that's when if it is something that's fundamental or it is something that needs to be fixed, that's when the fact that you've kind of formed these bonds lets you step in and go, okay, why don't we fix it together? And that's its own form of grace. So I would say those are the different ways in which I think you end up giving grace to others.
It's amazing. Well, Catherine, were there any other questions in the chat? Doesn't look like it.
You know, I see any. We are technically supposed to finish at 12:45 anyway, so we may be just right on.
Sorry.
Right on target.
No, it's
So,
perfect
well,
timing.
Well, then with that, I want to absolutely thank Tejal for this amazing discussion. Thank you for sharing your stories, your experiences. And I believe with that, we are done for the day.
Thank
you very
to
much.
everybody for attending as well. Angela and Tejal, that was really, really great. So important to take a break for learning like this. And hopefully we will be able to host a WAM event in person sometime soon this year.
That'd be great.
Everyone.
Thank you all. And if people do have more questions and stuff, you're welcome to reach out to me personally.
Awesome. Have a good afternoon, everybody.